of agencies agrees on a private arbitrator to settle disputes. But now you say, wait a minute, this is a world with no government. So who enforces those private contracts? But that problem we have already solved. Because as I started out by saying, the one kind of enforcement of contracts that does not require the government is the enforcement of contracts between firms that expect to be dealing with each other for a long time. And my agency and his agency are such a pair of firms. So that if the next time there is a dispute, my agency goes to the arbitrator, and the arbitrator says, he didn't steal the television set, you made a mistake. If my agency says, we don't care, we're going to take the television set, then his agency will refuse to abide by arbitration in the future, and they'll have to fight each other all the time, and their costs will be very high, and they will gradually lose their customers to other agencies that have more sensible and honest and honorable policies and are willing to keep their contracts with each other for arbitration. All right? So that's the basic framework sort of a simple model of an anarcho-capitalist society. And as with any picture of a real human institution, it's obviously very much simplified. And if you really had it working, you would see a lot more complication than I'm describing. As it happens, there is quite a good science fiction writer, Werner Vinge, who has a short story somewhere which describes a conflict between a state and an adjacent area run in the way I described. And it was really fascinating to me, because since he's a fiction writer, not an economist, he sort of put life into it. He showed what the things would look like, how people would feel about them, sort of the whole network of emotions and commitments and feelings that real institutions have. And at the end of the story, he referred to my book as the source for the ideas. And I sort of like when people steal my ideas. When you're young, you worry about people stealing your ideas. When you're old, you worry about people not stealing your ideas. And I reciprocated by stealing some of Vinge's ideas for other purposes. In any case, so I've described roughly what the system is like, but the reason that I brought it up in this talk is that I want to argue that it provides a solution to my problem. That is, that this is a set of institutions which will tend to generate good law for about the same reason, not exactly the same reason, but about the same reason that private markets build good cars. And let me take a brief and slightly technical digression, because good law is a pretty vague term. And among libertarians, there are a variety of ideas about what good law would be like, many of them based on a mistaken idea of how easy the question is. But I want to take a very simple economist's view. And what I mean by good law at the moment for this talk for the next 45 minutes is economically efficient law. And what does that mean? Imagine some change in a society, and I don't care what it is, which affects lots of people in different ways. And you could imagine finding out for each person, if he's in favor of the change, what's the most he'd pay to get it, and if he's against the change, what's the most he'd pay to stop it. And there is some economic sense in which the most somebody would pay to get something is the value of that something to him, and the most he would pay to avoid something is the disvalue of that something. And you can then imagine summing all those numbers. And if the sum is positive, if the benefit to the people who benefit as measured by what they individually would pay to get that benefit is larger than the summed cost to those who lose, we call it an economic improvement. And if it's negative, we call it an economic worsening. I don't want to argue this is the only thing anybody should care about. But I do want to argue that it is a very useful sort of summary measure of the effects of changes. And that on the whole, everything else being equal, changes that produce net benefits on average benefit people, though any change is going to hurt some people and help some people. And on average, changes that produce net costs on average hurt people. And I should say, for the economists in the audience, I'm really borrowing this approach to the problem of evaluating things from Alfred Marshall, who was the economist who more or less put together modern economics about 100 years ago. And for any economists in the audience, I am not following Pareto's approach, which I regard as a way of evading the problem rather than solving the problem. If people are curious, we can discuss that later, but those are two technical issues, I think, for this audience. But basically, what I'm going to argue is that the institutions I've described will tend to modify the law in ways that produce net benefit for the people who it affects. So think about it from the standpoint of an arbitration agency, a private court. In order for the private court to make money, people have to choose to use it. It has got to get pairs of agencies to agree on what court they will use. And part of the product the private court is selling is its legal system. Notice that this is not a society where everyone is under the same law. That's one of the things that seems weird about it. The law between him and me is determined by the agreement of his agency and my agency. The law between him and me is determined by the agreement between his agency and my agency. The law between the two of them is determined by the agreement between their two agencies. So it is a polylegal system, a system in which not everyone has identical law. There will be some pressure towards standardization, as in other markets, because it's easier to do business if people have about the same rules. But there will also be some pressure towards diversity, because different customers want different things. There may be some customers who are Orthodox Jews who would like a legal system that has various provisions designed to make it work better for Orthodox Jews. There may be some who are seriously believing Muslims. There may even, believe it or not, be some who are libertarians. You're going to have a diverse market of people who are, in effect, indirectly buying law through their enforcement agencies. And therefore, you would expect some diversity in the products that market produces. All right, what will the law look like? Suppose there is, just think about the agency that wants our business being the business of the rights enforcement agencies that we patronize. If it can think of a way of changing its law code that the customers of both agencies like, it has a clear incentive to do that, because that will make it better able to secure their business. Suppose it has a way of changing the law code that his customers like and my customers don't like. But suppose it's important to his customers and not very important to mine. So that if you could somehow do the market research, the court would conclude that his customers would pay an extra $10 million a year to get the legal rule changed in that way, and mine would only pay $1 million a year to stop it. Well, it's perfectly simple. My agency and his agency agree with the court to change the rule, and his agency pays my agency $2 million a year. So my agency won't be able to charge as much to its customers because it's producing a slightly less attractive product for them. Not quite the law they wanted, but it can cut its rates so they'll stay its customers. His agency is now producing a still more attractive product for their customers, so it can afford to raise its rates and keep customers. So if you generalize this argument, you can see that the sort of built-in dynamic of the system is going to tend to make shifts if those shifts produce net benefits. If the shift benefits the people who are affected by it more than it hurts it, there is some combination of the shift plus a side payment which you can get everybody happy with, and then using that combination, the private court will be more popular with its customers and therefore will be able to make more money for its services. All right? So that's the guts of the argument. That's the basic argument. And let me point out first why this works in a way in which government doesn't work, and second, why it does not work perfectly, which for an economist is often the most interesting question. So to begin with, your response might be, but this does no good, because although you and I know that libertarian laws are the best laws, most people don't, and therefore most people will choose to buy bad law. They'll choose, just as they choose to vote for bad law at present, they'll buy bad law in this case. And I want to point out that there are two very large differences between buying things and voting for them. The first is that when you vote for something, your voting for it has essentially no effect on your getting it. All right? I live in a country with 300 million people. You live, most of you, in a country with 200 million people. The chance that who I vote for president will determine who is president is somewhere vaguely around 1 in 10 million. it is not worth making any serious effort to figure out who I should vote for when I know that getting the right answer changes the odds by 1 in 10 million. Therefore, almost all voters are, in the language of economists, rationally ignorant. That is to say, it is rational to be ignorant when the information is worth less than it costs. And information about what government ought to be doing is almost invariably worth less than it costs, unless you're the member of a special interest group which can expect to get a very large benefit out of what government is doing. So for the ordinary voter, the same voter who, before he buys a car, will read consumer reports in the auto magazines and test drive 2 or 3 different cars and chat with his friends to see which one is happy with his car, will decide who to vote for according to whether he looks handsome or whether he has a really good-sounding 8-word slogan, or whether his friends will think well of him for voting for that person, not on the basis of any reasonable evaluation of the program of the candidate. When I'm discussing this question with students in America, I sometimes put the question to them, do you know the name of your congressional representative? And about half of them do, and about half of them don't. And I can't really put them down because I don't either. The point being that, first, there is no very good reason, except curiosity, or if politics is the game you like, to know the name of your representative. Because even if you go to all the trouble of reading the news and finding out what he's voting for and seeing if you like it, you still can't get him elected or unelected because you're one voter out of many, unless you have a lot of money or a lot of influence and what he's doing is helping you a lot, and then you can spend enough to affect things. So therefore, in the public market, as it were, in the voting market, voters are rationally ignorant. In the private market, on the other hand, if I decide which car to get, I get it. So if I make a bad decision, I end up with a car that breaks down and costs me a lot of money. If I make a good decision, I end up with a good car that lasts a long time. And that means that the same person who will rationally vote on no information at all on an unimportant question like who is president of Brazil will rationally try to do a good job of getting well informed on the question of what car he's going to buy. So that's one difference, because notice that in my system, law is now a private good and not a public good. Because after all, if I decide that the arbitrator who our 2 firms have chosen is really no good, that the legal rules that he imposes are bad, evil, wicked legal rules, and furthermore, he takes bribes, if I decide those things, what's the next thing I do? I say, I don't like my enforcement agent.